The European conquest and settlement of the Americas at the beginning of the early modern period brought about an immense and irreversible change in world history. Previously unknown peoples, cultures and technologies would encounter one another for the first time, and rumours of ancient civilizations with immense riches and exotic treasures would spur stories of a fabled El Dorado or a lost city of gold waiting to be discovered. Within a period of little over 40 years, the exploits of these Europeans would lead to the downfall of two once mighty empires, and in their place would be established the first truly global superpower. The histories of the Conquistadors, such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, are well known and documented ones. Perhaps less well known are the stories of some of their contemporaries who may not have gained the same fame and fortune in their lifetime, but nevertheless achieved remarkable feats of exploration and discovery with their ventures into unknown lands. In this 4-part miniseries, we will explore their truly remarkable and immense encounters in the New World. This is the history of the Conquistador, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. Born into a family of the minor nobility around 1490 in Jerez de la Frontera near Cadiz, Cabeza de Vaca was schooled in the art of war from an early age. He entered the retinue of the Duke of Medina Sidonia in 1503, serving as a page and chamberlain. Later, in 1511, he participated in the Italian wars against the French and was wounded at the Battle of Ravenna in 1512. He returned to Spain the next year, continuing to serve the Duke of Medina Sidonia in a military capacity, helping to suppress internal revolts against the Crown of Castile, as well as fighting against the French in their invasion of Navarre. Then, in early 1527, he was appointed as the royal treasurer for the upcoming Narvaez expedition to La Florida in the New World, effectively making him second in command. The fleet of 5 vessels set sail on the 17th of June 1527, carrying 600 soldiers and colonists. In August that year, they landed on Hispaniola to take on more provisions as well as purchase more horses and ships before making their way to La Florida. Whilst on Hispaniola, around 150 men deserted, perhaps after hearing of the disastrous expedition of Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon to La Florida. To add to this setback, there was also a shortage of horses for sale on Hispaniola, so Narvaez decided to sail on to Cuba with the hope of securing some there instead. After arriving in Santiago, Narvaez was able to strike a deal for a number of horses, but they were located further up the coast at Trinidad, so he instructed Cabeza de Vaca to set sail there with 2 small ships and collect them. Whilst Cabeza de Vaca was ashore closing the deal, a hurricane wrecked both of the ships at anchor, resulting in the loss of 60 men and 20 of the horses. Once Narvaez had regrouped with Cabeza de Vaca and the survivors, their fears of encountering more storms that could potentially jeopardize the entire expedition led to their decision to overwinter in Cuba, where they could replenish their losses by recruiting more men as well as buying more ships and horses. By February 1528, they gained more recruits and acquired 2 new ships, one of which was sent on to Havana to take on more supplies before they made the final leg of their journey to La Florida. As the fleet was rounding the western coast of Cuba, they encountered yet more storms and were blown off course into the Gulf of Mexico. Being unable to counter the strong currents and reach Havana, Narvaez decided to head directly to La Florida and begin the expedition. Landfall was made on the 15th of April 1528 near what is now Tampa Bay. Coming across a few nearby native villages, the Spaniards traded some trinkets with them in exchange for fresh fish and venison. But when they inquired as to whether they possessed any gold, the Indians bluntly replied by saying no, but that the Appalachee region to the north was rich with it. In light of this revelation, Narvaez decided that the expedition should head north and claim this land called Appalachie in the name of Spain. On the 1st of May 1528, he split his forces into 2 contingents, one which would head overland and the other which would go by sea in the ships. Cabeza de Vaca protested at this, saying that it would be too great a risk to split the expedition as there was no certainty that either party would be able to find the other once they had separated. Narvaez challenged Cabeza de Vaca by claiming that he was a coward and that he should remain with the ships. In order to maintain his integrity and position within the expedition, he reluctantly agreed to join Narvaez and head overland with 300 of the others, with the remaining 100 men going with the ships. They marched close to starvation for 2 weeks until they came across an Indian village, at which point they took the locals prisoner and helped themselves to the corn from their fields. Realising the precarious position he was now in, Narvaez hoped he could rejoin the ships on the coast, but neither of the 2 scouting parties he sent out could locate the fleet. With no other options available, Narvaez ordered the party to continue north. Over the next 2 weeks, the Spaniards had varying interactions with the local natives, some seemingly friendly whilst others were hostile. They managed to take a handful of prisoners along their way and use them as guides to locating Appalachia. On the 25th of June 1528, they'd reached a large settlement with 40 or so houses, believing it to be the capital of Appalachia. Their efforts appeared to be in vain, as no gold could be found. Whilst occupying the village, the party was attacked by the natives, and after finding no other settlements or gold nearby, Narvaez ordered the expedition to return south. The native guides told them of a village close to the sea called Aute, which had a lot of food, so it was decided to head there. On the way, the expedition was repeatedly attacked by the Indians, and they lost a number of men in the process. When the Spanish finally reached Aute, they found the village to be already deserted and burnt. They scavenged enough corn, beans and squash to feed themselves, with many of them now starving, wounded and sick. Whilst exploring the surrounding area, Cabeza de Vaca found a route out to the coast, at which point it was decided to abandon the expedition and try and reach Panuco in Mexico by sea. They set about constructing 5 small ships, each to hold 50 men out of the remaining 250 survivors. They constructed a forge out of a log and used deer skins for the bellows. They cut down trees and made charcoal for the forge. They then made hammers, saws, axes and nails out of their iron gear. Caulking was made from the pitch of pine trees, and palmetto leaves were used as oakum. They sewed their shirts together for sails, and they also killed their remaining horses to sustain themselves with meat, using the horsehair to braid ropes and the skins to make water bags. They then set sail on the 22nd of September 1528, heading westwards and hugging the coastline. They went ashore every few days to rest and gather what food they could find. When they reached the mouth of the Mississippi River, the current dragged them out into the Gulf of Mexico, where the vessels then became separated in a hurricane. Some of the ships were never seen again, including that which is led by Narvaez. 2 of the vessels were then washed up on what is now the South Texas coast, somewhere near present-day Galveston Island. Of the 250 who set off from Florida, only around 80 men had survived, Cabeza de Vaca being one of them. Without any food or supplies and now riddled with sickness and malnutrition, their numbers rapidly declined, with only 15 surviving that winter. Sometime after this, Cabeza de Vaca along with the remaining survivors were taken prisoner by the local Native American tribes. They lived alongside them in captivity for a number of years before 4 of them managed to escape. Cabeza de Vaca, Andreas Dorantes de Carranza, Alonso del Castillo Maldonado, and an African slave by the name of Estevanico, then fled into the wild expanses of what is now the southwest United States and northern Mexico. Their prior experience of living amongst the tribes of the Gulf Coast had given them some knowledge of the different peoples and languages of the region. They were able to adapt their lives to those of the local Indians that they encountered, with Cabeza de Vaca giving them names such as the Roots people, the Fish and Blackberry people, or the Fig people, depending on their principal food source. They wandered from tribe to tribe, trading with the locals in exchange for food and shelter, as well as offering healing and health treatments. Cabeza de Vaca became somewhat of a faith healer amongst these communities, attracting a growing number of followers, which he put down to his faith in God and Christianity. The native tribes conversely interpreted these strange foreigners as children of the sun, who had the power to both heal and destroy. Some years later, with his health now recovered, Cabeza de Vaca decided to try and reach the Spanish colony in Mexico. 8 years after their expedition began, in July 1536, near Culiacan in present-day Sinaloa, Cabeza de Vaca and the 3 other survivors with their Indian followers crossed paths with a group of Spaniards who were on a slaving mission. As he later wrote of this account, his countrymen were dumbfounded at the sight of me. Strangely dressed and in the company of Indians, they just stood staring for a long time. The Spaniards accompanied the survivors to Mexico City, then later, in 1537, Cabeza de Vaca sailed back to Europe. Whilst back in Spain, he wrote an account of his ordeal in the New World, known as La Relacion, detailing the failings of the Narvaez expedition and his subsequent travels and encounters with the Native American tribes of the region. This was not to be his only or last time in the Americas, as he would later return in 1540, but on this occasion he voyaged to South America. He was appointed as the governor of the Rio de la Plata and charged with the mission of finding a route westwards over land to the gold and silver mines of Peru. His governorship there ultimately ended in failure, as he was arrested for poor administration of the colony and sent back to Spain in 1545 to stand trial. Although he was later fully exonerated, he never returned to the Americas and died in Seville sometime between 1557 and 1560. Although Cabeza de Vaca did not conquer any new lands or gain any of the riches as he had initially anticipated from his expedition, his experience in the New World and subsequent documentation of it provides a fascinating and otherwise unheard of account of the native peoples living in pre-colonial North America. His very survival was owed to these Indian tribes, and for the remainder of his life he advocated for the rights and fair treatment of the Native American peoples. This is the history of the conquistador, Hernando de Soto. Born around 1500 near Badajoz in Spain, Hernando de Soto was from a family of the minor nobility, although they were relatively poor for their status. Faced with limited prospects for social advancement at home, he, like many young men in Spain at the time, set sails for the New World to seek fame and fortune. At the age of just 14, he joined Pedro Arias de Avila's expedition to conquer Central America. Whilst there, he earned a reputation as an excellent horseman, fighter and tactician, as well as gaining considerable wealth and political influence. After the conquest of what is now Nicaragua in 1530, Hernando de Soto led an expedition up the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, searching for a passage between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean in the hopes of enabling trade with the East Indies. After finding no such route, he then decided to leave his estates in Nicaragua and join Francisco Pizarro's expedition to conquer the Inca Empire in Peru. Appointed as a captain, he participated throughout much of the conquest and was a key figure in the capture of the Incan emperor Atahualpa. He even developed a friendly relationship with the leader of the Incas, teaching him to play chess shortly before his execution by the Spaniards. By 1534, Hernando de Soto was serving as the lieutenant governor of Cusco and had amassed an immense fortune from plundering the riches of the Incan Empire. He later applied to join Diego de Almarago's expedition to conquer what is now Chile, but he was turned down for the position. Having no more appointments to keep, he then packed up his treasure and returned to Spain in 1536. The staggering amount of wealth he had acquired allowed him to settle into a life of luxury in Seville, and he soon married the daughter of his previous patron. However, he was not content with domestic life, and so, in 1537, he asked King Charles V to send him back to the New World as the governor of Nicaragua. Unable to grant his exact request, King Charles sent him to Cuba instead, with instructions to explore and conquer Florida within 4 years. After spending a year in Cuba, preparing for the expedition, Hernando de Soto, with 620 men and 220 horses, set sail in 9 ships, bound for Florida. They landed somewhere around South Tampa Bay in May 1539. A short time after making landfall, some members of the expedition came across a man who claimed to be a Spaniard. His name was Juan Ortiz, and he had been held captive by the local Native American tribes after trying to locate the failed Narvaez expedition of 1528. During his captivity, he had learned a number of the local Indian languages and so became a valuable interpreter for Hernando de Soto. The expedition travelled north, exploring the west coast of Florida, before building an encampment for the winter in what is now Tallahassee. After hearing rumours from local Indians of gold being mined in lands to the northeast, Hernando de Soto instructed the expedition to head in that direction. Entering what is now Georgia and South Carolina, they came across a tribe headed by a female chief who was hospitable towards the Spaniards, providing them with food and shelter. Unfortunately for Hernando de Soto, there was no gold to be found, so, a short while later, he ordered the expedition onwards into the Appalachian Mountains to continue the search. After exploring the area for several months and contacting numerous native tribes, he had still not located any of the supposed gold. He then headed eastwards into modern-day Tennessee, again exploring the area and hoping to come across a native civilization rich with treasure. By now, the expedition was beginning to run low on food and supplies, so in accordance with the pre-arranged schedule, Hernando de Soto headed south to the coast of the Gulf of Mexico to rendezvous with 2 supply ships being sent from Havana. On the way, he encountered a fortified native settlement called Mabila, now in present-day Alabama. The Spaniards entered the town, but noticed that all the inhabitants were young warriors, which concerned them greatly. At some point, a disagreement occurred between a native chief and a Spaniard, which then rapidly escalated into a full-scale battle, which may have been a premeditated ambush by the Indians. De Soto's men were lucky to escape with their lives, but once they had fought their way out of the settlement, they then decided to seek retribution by going on the attack. During the 9-hour encounter, the Spaniards lost over 200 men, but they in turn massacred over 2,500 of the native Indians and burned Mabila to the ground. Having lost a considerable number of men, and with the expedition now hanging in the balance, Hernando de Soto was fearful that if they made contact with the ships on the coast, then word of what had happened would make its way back to Spain and damage his reputation. He therefore decided to turn his men around and head back into the interior. Having constructed another camp to see out that winter, in the spring of 1541, Hernando de Soto ordered the expedition to head westwards. They reached the Mississippi River on the 8th of May, and became the first Europeans to cross it by constructing flat-bottom boats. Venturing into what is now Arkansas, they constructed another winter encampment in which to seek shelter. That particular winter of 1541-1542 was extremely harsh, and a number of men of the expedition died, including the interpreter Juan Ortiz. Pushing further westwards, they then encountered increasingly hostile native tribes, and with no means of effectively communicating with them, Hernando de Soto decided to turn back towards the Mississippi. When he reached the western bank of the river, Hernando de Soto contracted a fever and died on the 21st of May, 1542. His body was reportedly wrapped in blankets and weighted down with sand, then carried in a boat into the middle of the Mississippi River and sunk to the bottom. On his deathbed, he appointed Luis de Mussoco Alvarado to take command of the expedition. 3 years had passed since they first landed in Florida. Now, with only half the number of men still alive and having no gold to show for their efforts, it was decided to abandon the expedition and try and find a way to Spanish-controlled territory. At first, they planned on building boats to sail down the Mississippi River and into the Gulf of Mexico towards Panuco, but this was considered too time-consuming and risky, so they continued heading westwards on foot into what is now Texas. The sparse and dry landscape provided them with little food to forage off, and with the native peoples being mostly nomadic, there were no settlements to raid either. They were forced to turn back once again towards the Mississippi, and with no other choice remaining, they set about constructing the boats to sail down the river and on to Mexico. After overwintering one last time and waiting until the spring floodwaters had subsided, they set off in July 1543 in their makeshift boats. Taking about 2 weeks to traverse the length of the river, the expedition encountered many hostile tribes along the way who attacked them in war canoes. The Spanish no longer had any effective weapons to repel the attackers, resulting in 11 of them being killed and many more wounded. On reaching the mouth of the river, they followed the coastline southwest, and after 50 days they finally reached Panuco in Mexico. A little over 300 of the original 700 men of the expedition had survived. Contemporaries of Hernando de Soto considered his expedition to be a failure, as he had not found any gold or conquered any new lands for the Spanish crown. Consequently, further efforts to explore the region and what is now the southeastern United States were overlooked, with the only exception being Florida and the focus instead being on the Pacific coast. Like Cabeza de Vaca before him, Hernando de Soto's account of the New World gives us an insight into the lives of the Native Americans before the colonial expansion of the Europeans. It also laid the foundations of the relationship between these two peoples, which, over the coming generations and centuries, would be marked by conflict and hostility. This is the history of the conquistador Francisco de Orellana. Francisco de Orellana was born in Trujillo in Spain sometime around 1511. He was a cousin of the Pizarro brothers, who would later become the most powerful family in South America during their conquest of the Inca Empire. He voyaged to the New World in 1527, first going to Nicaragua, but he later joined his cousins the Pizarros in their conquest of Peru in 1533. After the downfall of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, he supported the Pizarros in their dynastic feud with Diego de Almarago for control of the newly conquered territory. Francisco de Orellana was rewarded for his loyalty by Francisco Pizarro with lands in Ecuador. In 1541, he travelled to Quito to find his other cousin Gonzalo Pizarro, who was the governor there, and was making preparations to raise an expedition over the Andes Mountains, after hearing rumours of a land rich with gold somewhere to the east. The leader of this supposed land was said to cover his entire body in gold dust every morning and then wash it off each evening. He was said to be named the Golden One, or El Dorado. In February 1541, Gonzalo Pizarro set off, whilst Orellana stayed behind to gather more horsemen before rejoining him later in March. A force of 220 conquistadors and more than 4,000 native porters trekked across the Andes through almost impenetrable rainforest. Most of the natives died along the way, with the jungle providing little in the way of food to live off, and the Spaniards claiming what little there was for themselves and their precious horses. To add to this, the progress of the expedition was incredibly slow, which infuriated Gonzalo Pizarro. He vented his anger on the native guides, some of whom he tortured, burning them alive or having them fed to his dogs. Soon, the Spaniards began to run out of food as well, and so they turned to eating their horses. After a grueling 6 months in the jungle, they emerged from the foothills of the Andes and onto the embankment of the Coca River. By now, many of the expedition were ill and close to dying from starvation. Orellana tried to convince Pizarro to turn back, but he refused and instead ordered a boat to be built to carry the sick and the heavy supplies by river. The boat took a whole month to build, and on the 9th of November 1541 they set off again, heading east, with those who could not stand going in the boat and the rest walking beside the riverbank. Progress was again slow, as they could only travel as fast as the men on land could keep up with the boat. After 43 days of marching, by Christmas 1541 they constructed a camp. Many more men had now died of starvation. The remaining native guides informed Pizarro that the land which lay ahead was uninhabited and therefore had little in the way of food for the expedition. This news greatly alarmed him, as there were rumours amongst the men in the camp that some were beginning to consider a mutiny. Orellana then stepped forward and offered to go down the river in the boat with some of the men to try and find whatever food they could and bring it back to camp. Pizarro agreed to his request. He left the next day, on the 26th of December 1541, with 57 men in the boat. Soon after setting off, Orellana realised that the current on the river was too strong, and he would not be able to turn around and return to the camp as he had planned. They managed to stop the boat on the riverbank and waited a few days to see if Pizarro could regroup with them. However, there was no sign of him or his party, so without any other options, they continued down the river. On the 8th of January 1542, they heard drums being played somewhere in the distance and cautiously followed the noise until they came across a native village. As they went ashore, the native inhabitants fled, leaving behind their food cooking on the fires, which Orellana's starving men quickly took for themselves. The Indians soon returned to the village after realising the Spaniards were of no threat. They took pity on them and allowed them to stay in the village for a month, feeding them and allowing them time to heal and recover from their ordeal. Orellana took this opportunity to learn some of the native language, which he believed would be vital if the men were to survive what lay ahead. Meanwhile, Pizarro was still waiting for Orellana to return to his camp upriver, but as the days passed into weeks, he began to suspect treachery from his cousin. He shortly thereafter abandoned his expedition and turned back towards Quito. Only he and 80 other men would survive the journey home. Orellana's men had now recovered and began to hope that they might actually live to tell the tale of what had happened to them. Well aware they had not been able to return to Pizarro as they had planned, they began to record written evidence explaining why they had not been able to turn back, with each man signing a document as a witness and thus entrusting their lives to Francisco de Orellana to lead them home to safety. The man assigned as the scribe was Friar Gaspar de Carvajal, who began to chronicle the expedition. They continued on their journey, joining the Napo River and making good progress on the swift currents. They then came to a great confluence of water where the Napo joined the Amazon. Here they met more friendly tribes who were part of the Arapian Federation, and Orellana again recorded their languages and customs. The Spaniards stayed with the Arapians for 2 months, building a second, larger boat that would be able to cope with the wider river and also what they hoped would be the sea when they reached it. The expedition set off again in April 1542, heading down the Amazon River. The settlements which they passed on this stretch of the river were much greater than what they had seen before, a possible indication of advanced civilization, and perhaps one that also possessed gold. Often though, they were unable to go ashore and make contact, as the tribes of this region were much more hostile, and they became caught up in a number of skirmishes. In one such hostile encounter, on the 24th of June 1542, Friar Carvajal noted that the women of the tribe fought alongside the men, which reminded him of the warrior women of Greek mythology, the Amazons. He later named the site of this encounter as the River of the Amazons. It would only later be applied to the whole river and the rainforest around it. After 8 months had passed since they had set off from Pizarro's camp, in August 1542 they finally reached the sea, having sailed over 2,500 miles. Although they didn't know it at the time, they had become the first Europeans to sail the entire length of the Amazon River. Their journey was still not over though, as they then faced the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean. They followed the coastline north to the Spanish-controlled Caribbean island of Cuba. Francisco de Orellana, with 47 men, had survived. Back in Quito, Gonzalo Pizarro was now seeking revenge on Orellana for his apparent betrayal. He charged his cousin with treason against the Spanish crown for abandoning the expedition at its most perilous stage. In the resulting legal case that followed, Orellana was able to produce the signed documents of the expedition, which evidenced their inability to turn back and join Pizarro. Having cleared his name, he then returned to Spain and married Ana de Ayala. He couldn't settle into domestic life, so he petitioned the king to send him back to the lands which he had discovered on the Amazon. Appointed as the governor of New Andalusia, he set sail again on the 11th of May, 1545, with his wife accompanying him. The expedition was a disaster from the outset, with men deserting at the first opportunity and ships being lost in storms. When he reached the Amazon Delta, he frantically searched for the mouth of the river, but many men were now dying from sickness or encounters with hostile Indians. Orellana himself died, as his wife put it, from illness and grief, sometime in November 1546. The account of Francisco de Orellana's voyage down the river Amazon furthered the rumours of an El Dorado waiting to be discovered. He himself noted that the native settlements on the middle stretch of the river were like none he had ever seen before. Perhaps one of these could have been the fabled City of Gold. Unfortunately, the men of Orellana's expedition were probably the only Europeans to see these great civilizations, as in the years that followed their voyage, the native peoples of the Amazon would be practically wiped out by the diseases which the Europeans brought with them into the New World. This is the history of the conquistador, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was born in 1510 in the town of Salamanca to a family of the Spanish nobility. Despite his noble birth, he was not the eldest son and would not be expected to inherit the family estate. Instead, he was to find himself a suitable career from which to support himself with. In 1535, he voyaged to the New World to serve under the first viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza. Whilst there, he married the daughter of the treasurer, whose dowry included a large estate in Mexico. He later gained a position as the governor of New Galicia, making Coronado one of the wealthiest and most politically influential men in New Spain. Around 1539, word of a native settlement in the north that was rich with gold began to reach the ears of the colonial Spaniards. Coronado dispatched Friar Marcos de Niza and Estevanico, the famed survivor of the Narvaez expedition and companion of Cabeza de Vaca, to head north and see if they could locate this supposed city of gold. Only Friar de Niza would later return. He told of a city called Cibola, whose residents were assumed to have murdered Estevanico. Although Friar de Niza did not enter the settlement, he said that it stood high on a hill and that it appeared to be as wealthy and as large as Mexico City. Convinced that this Cibola was one of the mythical 7 cities of gold, Coronado urged Viceroy Mendoza to let him lead an expedition to find it. Mendoza agreed. Both he and Coronado donated vast sums of their own money to finance the expedition, hoping to recoup it later when they took the riches of Cibola for themselves. Coronado set off from Compostela on the 23rd of February 1540 at the head of an expedition consisting of some 400 conquistadors and 1,500 native Mexican Indian allies, as well as several slaves, servants, family members and friars, Marcos de Niza being one of them. They followed the coastline of the Gulf of California until they came across the northernmost Spanish settlements of San Miguel de Culiacan around the 28th of March 1540. There, Coronado rested his men and began to prepare for the trek inland. On the 22nd of April, Coronado led the first party of men up the trail, following the path which Friar de Niza had taken. After crossing several rivers and mountains, they came across a native settlement which Friar de Niza said would be the site of Cibola. It was not the City of Gold that he had previously described to Coronado, rather it was a simple village with a few pueblo buildings. Coronado's party were so disappointed and annoyed at Friar Deniz's over-imaginative description of Cibola that they forced him to turn around and return to New Spain in disgrace. Determined to press on, Coronado continued heading north, roughly following what is today the state line between Arizona and New Mexico, until he came across the Zuni River. At this stage, the food supplies of the expedition were beginning to run low, so Coronado approached the Zuni settlement of Howiku and asked if he could enter to seek food and shelter. The natives refused to grant them entry, so the Spaniards resorted to attacking the settlement. In the resulting skirmish with the Zuni Indians, Coronado became wounded and was forced to rest at Howiku for a number of weeks until he had recovered. During this time, he sent out several scouting parties to explore the area and locate the Colorado River, which he knew lay somewhere to the west. One of these scouting parties was led by Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, who travelled as far as the Grand Canyon and in the process became the first European to lay eyes upon it. Although, they were unable to scale down the sheer cliff faces and reach the river at the bottom, so they were forced to turn back to Coronado's base at Howiku. After Coronado had recovered, the expedition then continued heading east towards the Rio Grande. Another of his scouts had reported that the land which lay ahead was relatively prosperous and had a number of pueblo settlements which would make an ideal camp for the upcoming winter. Upon the expedition's arrival, they forced the local Tiwa Indians out of one of the pueblos and requisitioned it for their new headquarters. Coronado then issued orders to gather food and supplies from the surrounding native settlements, initially exchanging small trinkets with them, but as the natives began to run out of their own supplies, they refused to trade, at which point the Spaniards started to take whatever they wanted by force. That winter of 1540-1541 saw many further abuses against the Tiwa by the Spaniards. The Indians soon retaliated by killing some of the expedition's horses. Coronado in turn declared war on the Tiwa, in what became known as the Tigwax War, the first ever recorded conflict in what is now the United States. Coronado and his men attacked the remaining pueblos and slaughtered the inhabitants. By spring 1541, Coronado had been informed that another rich and wealthy nation, called Quivira, lay further to the east. He was led there by a native guide that the Spaniards called the Turk, whose intention seems to have been to lead Coronado and his expedition into the Great Plains and away from the beleaguered Tiwa Indians. They crossed the vast open featureless plains and encountered immense herds of buffalo along the way. Soon, they passed into a more hospitable landscape where there was shelter to be found in canyons and food to be scavenged from trees and plants. Here, they also came across another tribe of Indians called the Tayas. One of the elders of the tribe approached Coronado and told him that he was not the first of his kind to have been here. The old man said that he had met 4 others like him many days ago. This could have been a reference to Cabeza de Vaca, who most likely passed through this area some 6 years earlier. The Taya Indians also told Coronado that he was heading in the wrong direction to Quivira and that he should head north instead. At this point, Coronado had practically given up on finding one of the mythical 7 cities of gold, so he ordered the majority of the expedition to turn back. He, meanwhile, continued on, leading some 40 or so conquistadors on what was now a reconnaissance mission to explore Quivira. Passing into what is now Kansas, he eventually came across a tribe of the Quivira Indians hunting buffalo next to the Arkansas River. They led him to their settlements, which consisted of some 200 or so straw-thatched houses. Although Coronado was impressed by the size of their settlement, he was ultimately disappointed by the lack of material wealth that the natives possessed, with many of them wearing little to no clothes at all, never mind having any gold. Realising there was little point in continuing further, he ordered the remnants of the expedition to turn back, not before executing the native guide called the Turk, whose ploy to lead the Spaniards astray in the wilderness had now come to light. After a long and arduous journey, Coronado finally reached his old camp in Tigwax province. He overwintered there into 1542, then set off on his final leg of the journey back to New Spain in April. The expedition had been a failure, and although Coronado remained in his position as the governor of New Galicia until 1544, he was forced into bankruptcy as he had financed the expedition out of his own pocket and had not discovered any of the rumoured riches he initially hoped he would have. In addition to this, word of what had happened during the Tigwax War and Coronado's treatment of the native peoples of that region resulted in charges of war crimes being brought against him and also Garcia Lopez de Cardenas. Although Coronado was later cleared by the court, Cardenas was tried separately back in Spain and was convicted of the same charges. Having been virtually ruined by his expedition, both financially and in terms of his reputation, Francisco de Coronado retired to Mexico City, where he died of an infectious disease on the 22nd of September, 1554. Like the other conquistadors who had come before him, Francisco de Coronado did not discover any of the mythical cities of gold rumoured to exist in the Americas, but he did discover and record the peoples and the cultures of what is now the southwestern United States, as well as geographical features like the Grand Canyon. Coronado's expedition would also go down in history as having covered the greatest distance by land more than any other explorer in the New World.